All right, guys, it's time for yet another challenge. And in this challenge, you're going to be applying a lot of things, not just the things that you learned in the last lesson, but everything up until now. And the end result is going to be this beautiful to-do list where you're going to be able to add some new items, say buy milk, click add, and it gets added to a list of bullet points. And effectively, this is what you're aiming for. But in order to achieve this, then you might want to refer to the index.js and look at the challenge text. So the first step is when text is written into this input, the state should somehow be changed so that we can track the state of what's in the input. Next, when the add button gets pressed, whatever is currently inside the input should be saved and added to an array. Now, finally, the UL or the unordered list here should display all of the array items as separate list items. And all of these combined together, you should end up with this functionality. Go ahead and fork the starting project for this lesson. Look around the app.js and the index.js to see what you've got to work with, and then pause the video and try to complete the challenge. Once you're done, head back over here and I'll walk through the solution with you. Have a go now. All right, so the first thing we're going to tackle is when new text is written into the input, its state should be saved. So how can we do this? Well, we've done this quite a few times. We are going to create a new constant in our app function, and we'll give it a name that makes sense. Let's call it the input text. And then maybe we'll have a function to set it called setInputText. And it doesn't matter what you've called yours, as long as your code works, it's fine. And then we're going to, of course, invoke useState to be able to change and save the state of the input text when it gets changed. useState, of course, requires the import up here, and then we get to define an initial value, which I'll set to just an empty string because the input is blank to begin with. Now let's think about where we would want to use this input text. Well, in this case, we actually don't have an element on screen where we're going to be able to see the state changes for input text. But what we should do, though, is to add a value property to our input and to tie it to this input text state. So this way we are controlling the input and keeping the input value in line with the input text. The next thing to do is when do we actually want to change the input text? When do we want to call this function? Well, it's probably going to be when this input gets changed. So let's add an onChange to this input and get it to call a function, which we'll call handleChange. And then let's add this function right here, handleChange, and then we get the event that's going to be passed to it. Now, the next thing to do is to create a new constant, which is going to keep hold of the new value of the input. So we'll just call it new value, and I'm going to set it to event.target.value. Now, notice how in this case we've only got one input, so we don't actually care about the name of the input. So we don't actually need to use destructuring or anything fancy. We just want to get hold of the value of the target that triggered the event. And once we've gotten that, then we can call setInputText. And inside this function, we're going to pass it this new value. And because in this case, I'm not actually changing the input text, I'm not mutating it using setInputText, I don't actually need the previous value. It doesn't really matter. I've got this whole new value that I want to give it, which is going to correspond to whatever the user is typing inside this input. So now, how can we confirm that this is actually working? Well, we can go ahead and pop it out and then use our Chrome developer tools to check the state of our app. So we've currently got one state being tracked and it starts out being equal to an empty string. That sounds about right. And as soon as I start typing, you'll see that the state updates to reflect the latest state. So now that's being kept track of inside this input text. So we've now achieved part 1. Part 2 involves tapping into the moment when the add button is pressed and then passing the current data in the input to an array. So how can we do that? Well, the goal is to keep track of all of the items that the user has added inside an array. So we can create a new constant which is going to hold an array of items. So we can call it items, to-do items, whatever it is you want to name it. And then we're going to provide a name for the function which is going to set these items. And of course, we're going to use state. Now, the initial value for items is just going to be an empty array. It's not going to hold anything at all. And this means that when this to-do list starts out, we won't actually see any bullet points. So if we want to use this array of items to render all of the LIs to contain the text inside each item, then we would probably have to use what we learned about the map function. So we can tap into our items, call the map function, and then inside the map function, we can pass it an arrow function. And inside this arrow function, we'll get access to each item, or if you want to make sure that there's enough difference between the array and the individual item, you call it to-do item if you want. But effectively, just be sure that you know that this is going to be the singular form that comes from mapping through each of the items. And what we're going to return is an li which has the to-do item as the text in the list item. Now, notice how this syntax is not highlighting at all. It's not giving me different colors. And the reason, if I hover over it, is it says unexpected token. It doesn't recognize this as code. So if we highlight all of this and try to add the left-hand curly brace, it'll add the curly braces around this code and it'll get interpreted as JavaScript. Now, we can of course simplify this down even more because we're only returning a single item, so we can get rid of the return keyword, the opening curly brace, the closing semicolon, and the closing curly brace to end up with just this. So map through all of the items for each to-do item, create an li, and put the to-do item in that li is what we're telling our code to do. Now, all we have to do is call set items when the add button gets pressed. Now, the add button is, of course, this one, and we can simply add a onClick to it and get it to trigger a function. You can either get it to trigger an inline function, so you could add simply some sort of arrow function here. Alternatively, and what I would prefer, just in case we need to reuse this functionality, I'm going to call a function called add item. And then we get to create this add item function up here. And then inside this function, we're going to add whatever text is inside our input into our items array. Now to do that, we of course have to call set items. So let's call set items, and inside here, we want to get hold of the previous items so that we can simply add the new input at the end of the array as a new item. So to do that, we're going to have to create a new arrow function. Inside the input of this arrow function is going to be the previous items or previous values, or whatever it is you want to call it. And then what we're going to return is going to be a new array using the spread operator. Yeah, that's what you learned in the last lesson. You can spread arrays, you can spread objects, you can spread butter. It's really, really handy. So let's add our spread operator, add in all of the items from our previous items, and then we're going to add the new item, which is going to be what's currently inside our input text. So I'm going to leave my code as it is now, and I'm not going to simplify it further by removing the return because I think this reads much better, and it's already so short anyways. So now let's go ahead and give our app a spin and see if it works. Let's check our state we've got two. One is holding a single value. The other is holding an empty array. Let's go ahead and start adding some text by milk. That is being held inside our value, which is the input text. And then when I click add, you can see that our array now has a new value. At index 0, it's got by milk. And because the array now has a value, the state of it has updated, which triggered the map function to create a new list item. If we decide to add another item, say by egg, then our array also gets updated, and we now have this beautiful functionality. So the last thing that you might want to do is just to clear the input when you click the add button, ready for the next item. So the place to do that is probably going to be inside add item, so that once you've sent the input text to the items array, then after that has completed, you probably want to set the input text to an empty string again. So we can call set input text and pass in an empty string, just like that. Now, whenever we type in something by milk, hit add, it gets added, and then it gets cleared. Pretty neat, right? Now, did you manage to complete this challenge? If not, be sure to head back to review your code. And once you're happy with how everything is done, then head over to the next lesson, and we're going to talk about how to manage a component tree and how to pass state around in our component tree. Notice how at the moment we've only got one app component, and that's to try and keep it simple so you can see what's going on, because there's enough complex things going on. But in the next lesson, we're going to level up even more, and we're going to divide up our app into separate components so that we can pass state from child components up to parent components. As you can imagine, I'm going to need you to really understand everything that's already been covered so that you'll be comfortable in the next lesson. Take a breather, take a moment to pause, have a think, go for a walk, have some food, and once you're ready, I'll see you on the next lesson.